Amidst the glitter of crystal and false smiles, emptiness hides. A performance for the crowd by two broken souls. Everything changes as rivals become partners, and hardened hearts sometimes soften, or perhaps they simply surrender. The atrium of the Ministry of Magic did not look like a place of governance tonight. It looked like the inside of a jewel box, lined with crushed velvet and illuminated by the trapped golden breath of 1,000 enchanted canaries circling the high vaulted ceiling. The usual chill of the black tiles had been banished by warming charms that smelled faintly of cinnamon and old parchment, a scent that made Hermione Granger's heart ache with a sudden, sharp pang of nostalgia. She stood near the edge of the transfigured fountain, her fingers tightening around the stem of a crystal flute filled with elderflower champagne. The bubbles rose in a frantic, spiraling dance, mimicking the nervous flutter in her own stomach. She was alone. It was a fact that shouldn't have felt so heavy. She was a grown woman, a war heroine, the brightest witch of her age. She was perfectly capable of attending the annual victory ball without an escort. But the invitation had been for two, and the empty space beside her felt less like a vacancy and more like a wound. Ron was in Romania, a classified mission, Kingsley had said, his deep voice apologetic. Something about a smuggling ring of dark artifacts. Necessary work. Important work. Go, Hermione, Ron had said via Patronus 3 days ago, his silvery terrier voice crackling with distant static. Have a drink for me. Don't let them bore you to death. She took a sip of the champagne. It was too sweet. The problem wasn't the solitude itself. It was what the solitude invited. Without Ron's tall, reassuring presence to act as a shield, Hermione was exposed. She was the Golden Girl, a title that felt increasingly like a gilded cage. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, heavy, expectant, judging. The press photographers, hovering like carrion birds near the buffet tables, were waiting for a slip, a frown, a sign that the perfect heroine was cracking under the pressure of peace. She adjusted the strap of her dress. It was a deep, midnight blue silk that cascaded down her frame like water, chosen specifically because it was nothing like the sensible robes she wore to the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. Tonight, she was trying to be someone else, someone effortless. But the air was thick with the weight of unsaid things. The orchestra, floating on a dais of conjured clouds, began a waltz that was slow and melancholic, the violins weeping a melody that seemed to vibrate in her bones. Hermione scanned the crowd, looking for a friendly face, but saw only masks. Politicians with their frozen smiles, foreign dignitaries dripping in jewels that probably cost more than her parents' house, and former classmates who looked older than their years. And then she saw him. He was standing in the shadow of a marble pillar, far removed from the center of the dance floor, as if he were allergic to the joy being manufactured there. Draco Malfoy. He looked sharp. That was the only word for it. He was dressed in dress robes of black acromantula silk, cut with a precision that made him look like a weapon sheathed in velvet. His hair was the color of moonlight on snow, severe and immaculate, contrasting with the dark circles that faint glamour charms couldn't entirely hide. He held a glass of fire whiskey with long, pale fingers, staring into the amber liquid as if it held the secrets of the universe, or perhaps just his own regrets. He looked lonely. The thought struck Hermione with the force of a hex. It was absurd. Malfoys weren't lonely. They were exclusive, and yet the space around him was a tangible barrier. People gave him a wide berth, their gazes sliding over him with a mixture of fear and distaste. He was a spectre at the feast, the ex-Death Eater allowed back into polite society, but never truly welcomed. As if sensing her scrutiny, he looked up. Across the expanse of the swirling ballroom, grey eyes locked onto brown. There was no sneer, no familiar twist of arrogance, just a hollow, exhausting stillness. For a second, the noise of the party, the clinking glasses, the laughter, the swell of strings, faded into a dull roar. Hermione felt a strange jolt of recognition. He looked exactly how she felt, trapped. She expected him to look away, to dismiss her with that chilly indifference he had perfected since the trials. Instead, he held her gaze for a beat longer than was polite, his expression unreadable, before raising his glass in a mocking, microscopic toast. Then he turned back to the shadows. Hermione let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. "Mademoiselle Granger!" The voice was loud, wet, and entirely unwelcome. Hermione flinched, the spell broken. She turned to find a wizard in plum-coloured robes bear down on her. He was short, rotund, and sweating profusely. The embroidery on his chest identified him as part of the visiting French delegation. "Monsieur Delacour," Hermione said, forcing a smile that felt like it might crack the enamel of her teeth. It wasn't Fleur's father, but a distant cousin who lacked all the Vila charm and possessed twice the entitlement. "I have been looking for you everywhere," he boomed, stepping into her personal space. He smelled of garlic and expensive cologne. The saviour of the wizarding world all alone? It is a tragedy, a crime against beauty. "My partner is away on business," Hermione said stiffly, taking a subtle step back. "Business? On a night like this?" The wizard laughed, a wet, gargling sound. "If I were him, I would never leave your side. But perhaps he does not appreciate what he has. Perhaps the English men are too cold, yes?" He reached out, his damp fingers brushing against her bare arm. Hermione's skin crawled. It wasn't just the touch. It was the assumption of ownership, the way his eyes raked over her dress. "I assure you, I am quite happy," she said, her voice dropping to a temperature that could freeze water. "And I am currently heading to the refreshment table." "I will escort you," he insisted, grabbing her elbow. "And then we shall dance. I insist. The hero of the war deserves a partner who knows how to lead." Panic, sharp and irrational, flared in her chest. She couldn't dance with him. She couldn't be paraded around the floor by this man while the cameras flashed, creating headlines about Hermione Granger's new French romance. She needed an out. She needed a miracle. She pulled her arm away, perhaps a little too forcefully. I see a friend. Excuse me." She turned and walked away rapidly, not caring where she was going, only that it was away. She wove through the crowd, murmuring apologies as she dodged floating trays of hors d'oeuvres and swirling skirts. The French delegate was persistent. She could hear him calling her name over the music. She needed a shield. Any shield. She rounded the marble pillar and nearly collided with a wall of black silk. A hand shot out, steadying her by the shoulder. The grip was firm, the fingers cool. Hermione looked up, breathless, her eyes wide. Draco Malfoy looked down at her, his eyebrow arched in a perfect curve of aristocratic disdain. Up close, he smelled of rain, cedar, and the expensive scotch he was drinking. "Careful, Granger," he drawled, his voice a low baritone that vibrated in the small space between them. "If you throw yourself at me any harder, the prophet will have us married by morning." "Malfoy," she gasped, glancing over her shoulder. The plum-coloured robes were bobbing through the crowd, getting closer. Desperation clawed at her throat. She looked back at Draco, seeing the flicker of confusion in his stormy eyes. "Hide me," she whispered. The plea was out before she could check her pride. Draco's expression didn't change, but his eyes shifted, looking past her to the approaching Frenchman. Recognition and a sudden, sharp amusement flashed across his face. "Delacour's cousin?" he asked quietly. "The one with the wandering hands and the opinions on English dentistry?" "Yes," Hermione hissed. "He wants to waltz. I'd rather be crucioed." Draco looked at her, really looked at her. For a moment, the mask of the pure-blood air slipped, revealing something tired and surprisingly human underneath. He saw the panic in her eyes, the rigidity of her posture. He knew what it was like to be hunted at these events, to be consumed by the expectations of strangers. "Well," Draco said, swirling his drink, "we can't have the Golden Girl causing a diplomatic incident by hexing a foreign dignitary, can we? It would look terrible on Shacklebolt's report." Before Hermione could process what was happening, Draco moved. He didn't step away. He stepped in. He shifted his stance, effectively blocking her from the view of the main floor, caging her between the pillar and his own body. It wasn't aggressive, it was protective, a barrier of ice and silk. He leaned down, his face inches from hers, creating an intimacy that was startlingly absolute. "Laugh," he commanded softly. "What?" Hermione blinked, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Laugh, Granger. Look at me as if I've just said something terribly witty. Unless you want to spend the next 20 minutes discussing the intricacies of French grape stomping with Uncle Plum." The absurdity of it hit her. Draco Malfoy, her childhood tormentor, her ideological opposite, conspiring to save her from a bad date. A bubble of hysteria rose in her throat. "I don't think you're capable of being witty, Malfoy," she retorted, though her voice lacked its usual bite. "I'm a delight," he deadpanned, his eyes never leaving hers. "I'm the life of the party. Ask anyone. Now, smile, or I'll step aside and let him have you." Hermione forced a smile, though it felt jagged. "You're enjoying this?" "Immensely. It's not every day I get to see the Lioness of Gryffindor cowering from a man in velvet." "I am not cowering," she snapped, the irritation feeling grounding, familiar. "I am strategically retreating." "Keep telling yourself that." The plum robes bustled past their pillar. Hermione held her breath, her hand instinctively coming up to rest on Draco's forearm to steady herself. Under the fine fabric, his muscle tensed at her touch, rock hard. He didn't pull away. He didn't flinch. He just stood there, a solid, immovable object, shielding her from the world. She watched the Frenchman disappear into the throng of dancers. The air slowly left her lungs. "He's gone," she whispered. "You're welcome," Draco murmured. Hermione looked up at him. They were standing too close, far too close. She could see the flecks of blue in his grey eyes, the faint, jagged line of a Sectum Sempra scar vanishing beneath his collar. She became acutely aware of her hand on his arm, of the heat radiating from him. It was a dangerous warmth. It was the warmth of a fire that could burn the house down. She dropped her hand as if burned, stepping back. The cold rushed into the space between them instantly. "I didn't ask for your help," she said, falling back into old habits, trying to rebuild the walls he'd just walked through. Draco's face closed off, the shutter coming down. The bored aristocrat returned. "And yet, you received it. Consider it my contribution to international relations." He took a sip of his drink, his eyes scanning the room, already dismissing her, or pretending to. "You should go, Granger. Find your friends. You look out of place in the shadows." "And you don't?" she challenged, stinging from the dismissal. Draco looked at her, and the sadness in his eyes was so profound, so ancient, that it silenced her. "I am the shadow, Granger," he said softly. "I belong here. You don't." He turned to leave, to retreat further into the dark, but Kingsley Shacklebolt materialized from the crowd, his deep purple robes billowing. The Minister for Magic spotted them, Hermione flushed and Draco retreating, and a thoughtful, calculating look crossed his face. "Hermione, and Mr. Malfoy." Kingsley's voice was warm, authoritative, and inescapable. "Excellent. I was hoping to find you both." Draco froze. Hermione saw his jaw clench. "Minister," Draco said, bowing his head slightly. The respect was practiced, a survival mechanism. "I have a favor to ask," Kingsley said, stepping into their sanctuary. "The delegation from Bulgaria has just arrived. They are traditionalists. They are expecting to see unity, reconciliation. They have been reading the papers, and they are skeptical about the stability of our post-war society." Hermione felt a sinking sensation in her stomach. "Kingsley." "I need you two to sit with them at the high table," Kingsley said, his eyes twinkling with a mischief that didn't match the gravity of his request. "Show them that the old feuds are dead, that a Malfoy and a Granger can break bread without cursing each other, just for tonight." "Minister, I hardly think—" Draco started, his voice tight. "I am not asking as a friend, Draco," Kingsley said gently, but the steel was there. "I am asking as the minister who is trying to keep the trade agreements open." Kingsley looked between them. "Please, it's a few hours. Dinner, a few dances, smiles. Pretend you like each other, for the good of the ministry." Silence stretched between them. Hermione looked at Draco. He looked like he had swallowed a lemon. He was looking at her with a mixture of horror and resignation. "Fine," Draco spat, the word clipped. "But if she starts quizzing me on house elf rights, I'm leaving." "I wouldn't dream of boring you with morality, Malfoy." Hermione shot back, her chin lifting. "I'll try to use small words so you can keep up." Kingsley beamed, clapping a hand on Draco's shoulder. "Excellent. That is exactly the kind of spirited banter they will love. Come along. Your table awaits." As Kingsley led the way, Hermione felt Draco move beside her. He offered his arm. It was a stiff, mechanical gesture, born of pure etiquette. "Shall we, Granger?" he muttered, looking straight ahead. "Into the breach." Hermione hesitated, then slipped her hand into the crook of his elbow. The contact was electric, a sudden current that had nothing to do with static. His arm was warm, surprisingly, confusingly warm. "Don't step on my feet," she whispered. "Don't bruise my ego," he countered. And together, the Golden Girl and the Death Eater walked out of the shadows and into the blinding light of the ballroom floor. The walk to the high table felt less like a procession and more like walking the plank, though the plank was gilded and the sharks below were wearing diamonds. Hermione's hand burned where it rested on Draco's forearm. The heat of him was distracting, a steady, rhythmic pulse beneath the layers of silk that contradicted the icy mask he wore for the public. "Don't trip," Draco murmured, his lips barely moving, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere above the crowd's head. "If you fall, I'm not catching you. It would wrinkle my robes." "If I fall, Malfoy, I'm taking you down with me," she whispered back, a reflex of pure instinct. "Consider it a structural necessity." "Charming," he drawled. "I see the war hasn't dulled your murderous impulses." They reached the table, a long, imposing slab of obsidian floating on a cushion of magic, laden with silverware that gleamed threateningly under the chandeliers. The Bulgarian delegation was already seated, a row of stern faces and heavy furs that seemed entirely unsuited for the climate of the ballroom. In the center sat Ambassador Vasilev, a man whose beard was so thick it seemed to swallow the lower half of his face, leaving only a pair of dark, calculating eyes visible. Draco pulled out her chair. The gesture was fluid, practiced, and jarringly polite. Hermione hesitated for a fraction of a second, old instinct screaming that he might pull it away as she sat, before sinking onto the velvet cushion. He pushed her in, his hands lingering on the back of the chair for a moment too long, enclosing her in his space before he took the seat beside her. "Ambassador," Draco said, his voice dropping into that smooth aristocratic register that used to make Hermione's skin crawl, but now sounded strangely like a weapon being unsheathed. "It is an honor. May I present Hermione Granger? I believe her reputation precedes her." Vasilev grunted, his eyes narrowing as he assessed Hermione. "The Golden Girl," he rumbled, his accent thick. "We have heard much. They say you are formidable." "I try to be efficiently terrifying," Hermione said with a tight smile, reaching for her water goblet. "And you." Vasilev turned his gaze to Draco, his expression darkening. "The Malfoy heir. We heard stories of you as well. Different stories." The air at the table curdled. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Hermione saw Draco's hand tighten around the stem of his wineglass, his knuckles turning white. His jaw worked, a muscle feathering beneath the pale skin. He was waiting for the blow, the insult, the public shaming that had become his daily bread since the trials. "Stories are often exaggerated, Ambassador," Hermione heard herself say. Her voice was cool, clear, and sharp as cut glass. She surprised herself. She surprised Draco even more. She felt him stiffen beside her. "Mr. Malfoy was instrumental in the rebuilding of the potions archive at the Ministry this year. His expertise is unrivaled." It was a half-truth. He had donated the books, mostly to avoid a tax penalty, but it served its purpose. Vasilev looked between them, sensing the sudden united front. "Interesting," the ambassador muttered, losing interest in the provocation. "Let us eat." As the first course appeared, some sort of floating soup that smelled of dill and magic, Draco leaned slightly toward her. His shoulder brushed hers, a fleeting contact that sent a jolt of static through her nervous system. "I didn't need you to save me, Granger," he whispered, his voice laced with a complicated mix of resentment and wonder. "I didn't do it for you," she lied, dipping her spoon into the soup. "I just wanted him to stop talking. His voice booms like a cannon." "A valid point," Draco conceded. He picked up his own spoon. "Though I suspect you just can't stand seeing an underdog being kicked, even if the dog is me." "You're hardly a dog, Malfoy." she retorted quietly. More of a ferret. He choked on a laugh, masking it instantly as a cough. He looked at her, and for the first time that night, the grey eyes weren't guarded. They were bright with genuine amusement. Low blow, Granger. I thought we agreed to a truce. I never signed anything. Pity. I would have had my lawyers look it over. The dinner progressed in a blur of clinking cutlery and forced conversation. The wine flowed freely, a heavy crimson vintage that tasted of plums and oak, and with every glass, the rigid boundaries between them began to blur. The hostility that had defined their relationship for a decade was slowly being eroded by the shared absurdity of their situation. They were two soldiers from opposite sides of a war, trapped in a room full of people who treated the conflict like a dinner party anecdote. "Look at the wizard in the green turban," Draco murmured later, leaning close enough that his breath stirred the loose curls near her ear. The sensation was intimate, illicit. 3 seats down. He's trying to charm the enchanted napkin into a swan, but he's accidentally turned it into a dead chicken. Hermione glanced over and stifled a snort into her napkin. Oh, that's awful. That's the head of magical transportation. You'd think he'd be better at moving things. He's clearly drunk, Draco observed, taking a long sip of his wine. Unlike us, we are the picture of sobriety and decorum. I'm tipsy, Hermione admitted, the confessions slipping out. The room felt softer, the lights less harsh. And my feet hurt. The price of vanity, Draco said, glancing down at her shoes hidden beneath the table. Though I suppose the extra 3 inches of height were necessary to look me in the eye when you yell at me. I don't yell, Hermione argued, feeling a flush rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the wine. I articulate passionately. You shriek, Granger. It's part of your charm, like a banshee with a library card. You are insufferable. And you are trapped with me, he said. And there was a sudden drop in his tone, a shift from playful to something darker, heavier, for the rest of the night, at least. He turned his head, his face inches from hers. In the candlelight, the sharp angles of his face were softened. She could see the faint stubble along his jawline, the way his eyelashes cast long shadows on his cheekbones. He looked tired, not just physically, but existentially. And in that moment, Hermione felt a dangerous pull, a curiosity. What was it like to be him? To be hated by the world and yet expected to lead it? Why did you come tonight? She asked, the question stripping away the banter. Draco looked away, staring into the depths of his wineglass. Mother insisted. She thinks if I attend enough of these masquerades, people will forget the mark on my arm. She thinks redemption is something you can purchase with enough galleons and good behavior. Do you believe that? He looked back at her, his gaze intense, searing. I think redemption is a myth. There is only survival, and paying for your mistakes until the debt is cleared. That sounds lonely, Hermione whispered. It is, he said simply. The vulnerability hung between them, raw and exposed. Hermione felt a sudden urge to reach out, to touch his hand where it rested on the white tablecloth. It was a mad impulse. This was Draco Malfoy. He had called her names. He had watched her be tortured in his drawing room. But the boy who had done those things was gone, replaced by this broken, beautiful man who smelled of cedar and regret. Before she could act on the impulse, Ambassador Vasilev slammed his goblet down on the table, startling them both. "A toast!" the large man bellowed, standing up unsteadily. "To the unity of the wizarding world, to the erasing of old bloodlines and new beginnings." It was a clumsy toast, meant to be inclusive, but landing with the grace of a bludger. The table murmured their assent. Draco raised his glass, his expression unreadable. "To new beginnings," he murmured, but he wasn't looking at the ambassador. He was looking at Hermione. She raised her glass, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "To survival," she corrected softly. Draco's lips quirked up in a half-smile, a real one, small and private. "To survival." They drank. The wine was warm, spreading through her chest like liquid courage. As she lowered her glass, she felt a pressure against her leg. Draco's knee had shifted, pressing firmly against hers under the table. He didn't pull away. He didn't apologize. He just let the contact remain, a solid, grounding anchor in the swirling chaos of the ball. It was improper. It was confusing. It was the most comforting thing she had felt all evening. "Granger," he said, his voice low, vibrating through the point of contact. "I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but the orchestra is tuning up for the second set. And Vasilev is looking at you like he wants to ask you for a polka." Hermione's eyes widened in horror. She looked at the ambassador, who was indeed wiping his beard and eyeing her with predatory intent. "Do something," she pleaded, turning to Draco. The earlier friction was gone, replaced by a desperate alliance. Draco sighed, the sound resigned, but the glint in his eye sharp. He set his glass down with a definitive clink. "I suppose I must," he said, standing up. He towered over her, blocking the ambassador's view. He extended a hand, palm open, fingers long and inviting. "Ms. Granger, I believe this dance is mine, as per the ministry protocol." "Protocol?" she asked, breathless, staring at his hand. "Strict regulations," he said, deadpan. "Section 4, paragraph 2. The highest-ranking war heroines must be saved from bad dancers by the nearest available ex-villain. It's the law." Hermione laughed. It was a genuine, bubbling sound that made heads turn. She placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, cool and strong, pulling her up from the chair. "Well," she said, stepping into his space, the scent of him enveloping her completely. "We wouldn't want to break the law, would we, Malfoy?" "Never," he murmured, leading her away from the table and toward the dance floor. "I'm on probation, after all." As they walked away, the heat of his hand in hers felt less like a performance and more like a promise. The night was far from over, and the danger was no longer the foreign dignitaries or the press. The danger was the man walking beside her, and the terrifying realization that she didn't want him to let go. The dance floor was a sea of swirling fabric and light, a living, breathing entity that seemed to inhale the guests and exhale them in synchronized patterns. To Hermione, standing on the precipice of that motion with Draco Malfoy, it looked like a battlefield disguised as a ballroom. "Ready, Granger?" Draco's voice was close to her ear, low and devoid of the mockery she expected. It was a serious question. He was offering her a chance to back out, to flee back to the safety of the hors d'oeuvres and the judgmental stares. "I'm a Gryffindor, Malfoy," she whispered, though her pulse was fluttering like a trapped bird in her throat. "I don't run." "Pity," he murmured, stepping closer. "I was hoping for a chase." He didn't wait for her retort. He moved with a decisiveness that stole the breath from her lungs. One hand slid around her waist, settling firmly against the small of her back. The contact was startling. Not tentative, not polite, but possessive. Through the thin silk of her dress, his palm felt searingly hot, a brand of reality in a room full of illusions. His other hand clasped hers, lifting it to the proper height, his fingers lacing through hers with a casual intimacy that made her knees weak. "Relax," he instructed, his grey eyes locking onto hers. "You're stiff as a board. If you march, we'll look ridiculous. Float, Granger." "I am not marching," she hissed, though she forced her shoulders to drop. "I am calibrating. Calibrate faster. The violins are starting." And they were. The orchestra, perched on their cloud dais, swept into a melody that was lush and sweeping, a waltz that demanded surrender. Draco moved, and Hermione had no choice but to follow. She had expected him to be competent. Draco Malfoy did nothing by halves, but she hadn't expected this. He didn't just dance. He navigated the floor like he owned the very air they moved through. He was fluid, precise, his body a solid anchor against the centrifugal force of the turns. He anticipated her movements before she even made them, guiding her with subtle shifts of pressure against her back, steering her away from colliding couples and trailing robes. It was infuriating. It was intoxicating. "Where did you learn to do this?" she asked, breathless, as they spun past a blurring tapestry of gold and green. "Manner lessons," Draco said, his expression concentrated. "From the age of 5, Mother used to enchant a broomstick to dance with me. If I stepped on its bristles, it would swat me." Hermione let out a startled laugh, her head tilting back. "You're joking." "I wish I were. Madame Pince has nothing on a disgruntled clean sweep 7. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, transforming his face from severe to something almost boyish. "And you? Did Weasley teach you to waltz in between saving the world?" The mention of Ron was a sharp pinch, a reminder of the reality she was currently ignoring. "My parents," she said softly. "They took ballroom dancing classes when I was little. They practiced in the living room on Sundays." Draco didn't mock her. He didn't make a comment about muggles. He simply tightened his grip on her hand slightly, a silent acknowledgement of the loss she carried. The parents who didn't remember her, the life she had sacrificed. "Well," he said, his voice rougher than before, "they taught you well. You haven't stepped on me once." "Give me time," she warned, but the bite was gone. They fell into a rhythm then, a silence that was louder than the music. The world narrowed down to the space between them. The ministry, the politics, the staring eyes, it all dissolved into a haze of colour. There was only the pressure of his hand, the scent of rain and cedar, and the grey eyes that watched her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. It was dangerous. Hermione knew this with a clarity that terrified her. She was dancing with Draco Malfoy, and she wasn't hating it. She was feeling. She was feeling the way his chest rose and fell with his breath. She was feeling the strength in his arm as he spun her out and pulled her back in, the movement creating a rush of air that cooled her flushed cheeks. She looked up at him, really looked at him, stripped of the prejudices of the past. She saw the fine lines of strain around his eyes, the tension in his jaw. She saw a man who was holding himself together by sheer will, a man who was just as trapped in this performance as she was. "Stop thinking so loud, Granger," he murmured, spinning them near the edge of the fountain. I can hear the gears turning from here. I was just thinking, she said, her voice trembling slightly, that you're not as terrible as you pretend to be. Draco's step faltered for a fraction of a second, imperceptible to anyone watching, but seismic to Hermione. His eyes darkened, the storm clouds rolling in. "Don't make that mistake," he warned, his voice low and dangerous. "I am exactly what you think I am. A coward, a ruin, a Malfoy. You're also the only person in this room who hasn't looked at me like a prize to be won or a statue to be worshipped," she countered, the words tumbling out before she could check them. "You look at me like I'm just me." Draco stopped spinning. The music was still swelling, the other couples still whirling around them, but they stood still in the center of the chaos, an island of stillness. He looked down at her, his expression raw, stripped of all artifice. "And how do you think I see you, Granger?" he whispered. "I don't know," she admitted, her breath catching. He leaned in, his face inches from hers. For a wild, insane second, she thought he might kiss her. The air between them crackled with a magic that had nothing to do with wands. It was magnetic, terrifying, inevitable. "I see you," he said, the words heavy, "as the only thing in this room that is real." The confession hung between them, shimmering and fragile. Hermione felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, from the wine, from the exhaustion, from the sheer, overwhelming relief of being seen. Then the music ended. The final chord crashed down, shattering the bubble. Applause broke out around them, sharp and jarring. The reality of the ministry atrium rushed back in. The heat, the noise, the flash of cameras. Draco pulled back instantly, the mask slamming back into place. He released her waist, his hands retreating to his sides, though his fingers flexed as if they missed the contact. He looked shaken, his pale skin flushed, his breathing slightly elevated. "We should get a drink," he said, his voice clipped. "That was adequate." "Adequate," Hermione repeated, a hysterical laugh bubbling in her chest. She felt like she had just run a marathon. Her legs were shaking. "Yes, perfectly adequate." He offered his arm again, but this time he didn't look at her. He looked at the exit, at the balcony doors that promised cool night air and escape. "Fresh air," he amended, "before the prophet photographers corner us and ask us to name our firstborn." "Lead the way," Hermione breathed, slipping her hand onto his arm. They moved through the crowd, ignoring the calls of their names, ignoring the curious glances. They moved with a singular purpose: escape. As they stepped out onto the enchanted balcony, the noise of the party faded into a dull hum behind the heavy glass doors. The night air was crisp and cold, biting at Hermione's bare shoulders. Below them, London sprawled out in a grid of glittering lights, muggle and magical worlds bleeding into one. Hermione shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. Without a word, Draco began to unbutton his outer robe. He shrugged it off, a heavy garment of black wool and silk, and draped it over her shoulders. The warmth of his body was still trapped in the fabric, enveloping her in his scent. "You'll catch your death," he muttered, leaning against the stone railing and looking out at the city. He was in his shirt sleeves now, the white linen stark against the night, his forearms exposed where the cuffs were rolled up. The dark mark was hidden, but she knew it was there. just as she knew the scars on her own arm were hidden beneath her glamour. "Thank you," she said softly, pulling the robe tighter. It was too big for her, the sleeves hanging over her hands. It felt like a hug. "Don't get used to it," he said, staring at the horizon. "Chivalry is a dying art, and I'm a terrible practitioner." "You're doing a poor job of proving that tonight," she said, moving to stand beside him. She didn't look at him. She looked out at the city, mimicking his stance. They stood shoulder to shoulder, separated by inches, yet connected by the invisible thread that had been spun on the dance floor. "Why, Malfoy?" she asked again, quietly. "Why are you really being this? Civil, kind, even?" He was silent for a long time. The wind ruffled his hair, messing up the perfect styling. He looked younger like this. "Because," he said finally, his voice barely audible over the wind, "I am tired of fighting, Granger. I am so incredibly tired. And tonight, for a few minutes, it felt like the war was finally over." He turned his head to look at her then. The moonlight washed him in silver, making him look ethereal and tragic. "Did you feel it too?" he asked. Hermione looked up at him, clutching his robe against her chest. She thought of the dance, the heat of his hand, the way he had shielded her from the French delegate, the way he had just admitted his own exhaustion, mirroring hers. "Yes," she whispered. "I felt it too." Draco nodded, a sharp, jerky motion. He looked like he wanted to say something else, something dangerous, but he swallowed it down. "Good," he said. "Then we survive the rest of the night, together." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver flask. He uncapped it and took a swig, then offered it to her. "Fire whiskey," he said. "Better than that sparkling elderflower swill they're serving inside." Hermione took the flask. It was warm from his pocket. She raised it to her lips and took a sip. The liquid burned pleasantly on the way down, settling in her stomach like a hot coal. She handed it back, their fingers brushing. "Together," she agreed. But as she looked at him, standing there in the moonlight with his demons and his unexpectedly gentle hands, Hermione knew that surviving was no longer the right word. She wasn't just surviving the night with Draco Malfoy. She was starting to want the night to never end. And that was the most terrifying thought of all. "We should go back inside," Draco said, though he made no move to leave. "People will talk." "Let them talk," Hermione said, a sudden recklessness seizing her. "I'm not ready to go back to being the golden girl yet." Draco looked at her, surprise flickering in his eyes. Then a slow, crooked smirk spread across his face, the first genuine smile she'd seen on him in years. "Very well, Granger," he said, turning fully toward her, blocking the wind with his body. "Then tell me, what exactly did you think of the minister's hat?" Hermione laughed, and the sound carried out over the sleeping city, light and free. Under the heavy black robe, her heart beat a frantic, hopeful rhythm. The enemy was gone. In his place stood a boy she was just beginning to know, and for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid. The transition from the biting wind of the balcony back into the humid, perfumed air of the atrium felt like walking into a wall of solid gold. The noise hit them instantly, a cacophony of polite laughter, enchanted strings, and the clinking of crystal that grated against Hermione's fraying nerves. She hesitated at the threshold, her hand instinctively clutching the lapels of Draco's heavy robes, which still draped over her shoulders. The wool was rough against her bare neck, a tactile contrast to the silk of her dress, and it smelled intoxicatingly of him. Ozone, expensive starch, and that underlying note of wood smoke. It was a shield, and she was loath to give it up. Draco paused beside her, his silhouette sharp against the backlight of the ballroom. He noticed her hesitation, his grey eyes softening at the corners. "As much as the dark night look suits you, Granger," he murmured, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in her chest. "If we walk in there with you wearing my family crest, the gossip columns will implode before we reach the buffet." Hermione let out a reluctant sigh, the spell of the balcony thinning, but not breaking. "I suppose you're right, though it was nice to be warm for a moment." "I'm full of surprises," he drawled, stepping closer. "Turn around." It was a command, but it lacked the imperiousness of the old Draco. It was soft, almost intimate. Hermione turned, presenting her back to him. She felt his hands grasp the shoulders of the robe. He didn't just yank it off. He slid it down her arms with a slow, deliberate friction that sent shivers racing down her spine, chasing away the phantom warmth of the wool. His knuckles grazed the bare skin of her shoulders. Accidental, perhaps, or perhaps not. The touch was cool, shocking, and burned long after he had pulled away. "There," he said, his voice slightly rougher than before. "Back to being the indefatigable war heroine. Try not to look so disappointed." Hermione turned back to face him. He was shrugging the robe back on, the movement fluid and elegant. As he buttoned it, hiding the vulnerability of his shirt sleeves, the mask of the Malfoy heir slid back into place. But it didn't fit as tightly as before. There was a crack in the porcelain, and through it she could see the boy who had just shared a flask with her in the moonlight. "I'm not disappointed," she lied, smoothing her dress. "Just bracing myself." "Then let's find a fortification," Draco said, offering his arm again. This time, her hand found the crook of his elbow without hesitation, her fingers curling into the fabric as if they belonged there. "I believe there's an alcove near the Department of Mysteries entrance that is perpetually shadowed, and, more importantly, close to the reserve wine supply. Lead the way, Malfoy," she whispered, a conspiratorial smile tugging at her lips. They navigated the perimeter of the ballroom like two spies in enemy territory. The dynamic had shifted irrevocably. Before, they were two drowning people clutching at driftwood. Now, they were a distinct unit, a team of two united by a mutual disdain for the pageantry around them. They found the alcove. It was obscured by a large, potted, fanged geranium that snapped lazily at passers-by, discouraging interruptions. Draco vanished for a moment and returned with a bottle of elf-made wine and 2 clean glasses, moving with the stealth of a thief. "Plunder," he announced, pouring the dark red liquid. "Don't tell Shacklebolt. I'm trying to keep my record clean." Hermione took the glass, the crystal cool against her flushed fingertips. She leaned back against the stone wall, kicking off one heel and sighing in pure, unadulterated relief as her foot touched the cool floor. "Scandalous," Draco noted, his eyes tracking the movement. He leaned against the opposite wall, closing them into a private triangle of shadow. Barefoot at the ministry ball. Whatever would McGonagall say? "She'd say I was being practical," Hermione retorted, taking a generous sip of the wine. It was rich and velvety, loosening the knot of tension between her shoulder blades. These shoes were designed by a sadist, I suspect a goblin with a grudge against Gryffindors. Or a fashion designer with an eye for calves, Draco murmured into his glass. Hermione choked on her wine. She looked up at him, eyes wide. "Excuse me?" Draco didn't flush. He simply swirled his drink, looking at her over the rim with a challenge in his eyes. "I'm just appreciating the aesthetic, Granger. Don't read too much into it." "It's the alcohol talking." "You've barely touched your drink," she pointed out. "I'm a lightweight. Emotional fragility, remember?" They laughed together, the sound low and easy. It was strange how natural this felt. The bickering, the teasing. It was a language they had spoken for years, but now the venom had been drained out, leaving only the rhythm. It was foreplay disguised as warfare. "Look at that," Draco said, gesturing with his glass toward a gap in the foliage. Hermione leaned forward, her shoulder brushing his chest. The contact was electric, a sudden reminder of his physical proximity. She followed his gaze to the center of the dance floor, where Harry Potter was being aggressively spun around by a witch in neon pink robes who looked like a sentient flamingo. "Oh, poor Harry," Hermione giggled, the sound bubbling up uncontrollably. "That's Romilda Vane. She's been trying to corner him for an hour." "Potter looks like he's calculating the height of the nearest window," Draco observed, a smirk playing on his lips. "I should save him. It would be the ultimate plot twist. Malfoy saves the chosen one from aggressive courtship." "Don't you dare," Hermione said, reaching out to grab his forearm. "If you go, I'm left here alone with the fanged geranium, and I think it likes the smell of my perfume." Draco looked down at her hand on his arm. His gaze held hers, the grey deepening to the colour of a stormy sea. He didn't move to leave. "Priorities," he agreed softly. "I suppose Potter can fend for himself. He has a saving people thing. Let him save himself for once." He didn't shake her hand off. Instead, he covered it with his own, his long, cool fingers resting over her warm ones. It wasn't a hold. It was a caress, a silent acknowledgement of the request. "Stay." "Tell me something, Granger," he said, his voice dropping to a hush that excluded the rest of the world. "If you weren't here, pretending to be a diplomat, where would you be? Right now?" Hermione considered the question, the wine making her honest. "Home," she whispered. "In my library. Crookshanks asleep on my feet. A fire in the grate. Reading something. Useless. Something that isn't a law book or a treaty." "Useless?" Draco raised an eyebrow. "I didn't think the word existed in your vocabulary." "I like fiction," she admitted, feeling a blush rise. "Muggle romance novels. They're predictable, safe. People fall in love, there's a misunderstanding, they fix it, and they live happily ever after. No wars, no dark lords, just feelings." Draco looked at her with a mixture of amusement and something else, something akin to longing. "Happily ever after," he repeated, tasting the words like a foreign spice. "Must be nice to believe in that." "And you?" she asked, turning the focus back on him. The intensity of his gaze was making it hard to breathe. "Where would you be?" Draco looked away, staring into the dark corner of the alcove. His thumb began to stroke the back of her hand, a subconscious, rhythmic movement that sent jolts of heat straight to her core. "Flying," he said quietly. "Not for Quidditch, just up, above the clouds where it's silent, where the air is too thin to hear the whispers. Sometimes I think if I fly high enough, I can outrun the shadow of my own name." The vulnerability of the admission hung in the air, fragile as spun glass. Hermione's heart ached for him. She saw the loneliness he wore like a cloak, the crushing weight of a legacy he hadn't chosen. "You're doing it, you know," she said softly. "Doing what?" "Outrunning it. Tonight. I don't see the name Draco. I just see you." The use of his first name was a watershed moment. It hung between them, stark and undeniable. Draco froze, his hand stilling on hers. He turned his head slowly, his eyes locking onto hers with a hunger that frightened her. It wasn't a hunger for power or status. It was a hunger for this, for the acceptance she was offering. "Hermione," he breathed. It sounded like a prayer or a confession. The air in the alcove grew thick, charged with a tension that was no longer friendly. It was heavy, pulling them toward each other like gravity. Hermione watched his gaze drop to her lips, then flick back up to her eyes, asking a silent question. Her breath hitched. She leaned in, just an inch. "There you are." The voice was loud, boisterous, and shattered the moment into 1,000 jagged pieces. Draco flinched violently, his hand snatching away from hers as if he'd been burned. Hermione jerked back, her heels skidding on the stone floor. They both turned to see Cormac McLaggen standing at the entrance of their alcove, holding 2 overflowing goblets and looking thoroughly pleased with himself. I saw a flash of that distinctive hair," Cormac boomed, ignoring, or oblivious to, the murderous look on Draco's face. "Hermione, hiding away with the enemy? Very naughty." "Go away, McLaggen," Draco snarled, his voice pure venom. The soft, vulnerable boy from a moment ago was gone, replaced by the sneering prejudice of his youth. It was a defense mechanism, Hermione knew, but it still stung to see it return so quickly. Now, Malfoy," Cormac leered, stepping into their space. "Don't be greedy. You've had the Golden Girl all night. Share the wealth." He reached for Hermione, his hand aiming for her waist. Before Hermione could draw her wand, or even a sharp breath, Draco moved. He stepped between them, his movement a blur of black robes. He didn't draw his wand, but the way he stood, chest to chest with Cormac, was more threatening than any hex. "Touch her," Draco said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "And I will ensure that the Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes has to scrape you off the ceiling." Cormac blinked, his bravado faltering under the sheer, cold malevolence radiating from Draco. We're old friends, Hermione and I." "She doesn't look like she wants to be your friend right now," Draco hissed. "She looks like she wants to vomit, which, coincidentally, is how I feel looking at your tie." "Draco," Hermione said softly, placing a hand on his back. She could feel the tension in his muscles, coiled tight as a spring. She didn't want a duel. She didn't want a scene. "It's fine. I'm tired. I was just leaving." Draco didn't step back. He held Cormac's gaze for another long, agonizing second, establishing dominance before turning his back on the wizard. It was a gesture of supreme dismissal. He looked at Hermione. The anger in his eyes faded, replaced by a frantic concern. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she whispered, though she was shaking. Let's go. Please." "Yes," Draco said. He grabbed the bottle of wine by the neck. "We're done here." He guided her past a spluttering Cormac, his arm around her shoulders again, not just as a shield this time, but as a claim. "Mine," the gesture said. "Do not touch." They walked fast, leaving the music and the laughter behind. They didn't speak until they reached the apparition point in the atrium, a designated zone for departures. The hall was quieter here, the high ceilings echoing with the sound of their footsteps. "I'm sorry," Draco said abruptly, stopping near a fireplace. "I lost my temper. It was unseemly." "It was brilliant," Hermione admitted, a breathless laugh escaping her. "He looked like he was going to wet himself." Draco looked at her, and the tension broke. A reluctant smile tugged at his mouth. "He does have a terrible tie." "Hideous," she agreed. They stood there, the adrenaline fading, leaving them exhausted and raw. The ball was over for them. The night was ending. But the thought of parting ways, of going back to their separate, lonely lives, felt physically painful. Hermione started, not sure what she was going to say. "I don't want to go home." "My feet are killing me," she said instead. Draco looked down at her feet, then back up at her face. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were burning. "My flat is closer," he said. The words were rushed, as if he expected her to laugh in his face. "It's just around the corner from the ministry. I have better wine, and a fireplace that actually works." He paused, swallowing hard. "And I give excellent foot massages, or so I've been told." It was a proposition, not for sex. It was too fragile for that. It was a proposition for intimacy, for extending the truce, for not being alone. Hermione looked at him, the grey eyes, the nervous hand adjusting his cuff, the hope he was trying so hard to hide. "Do you?" she asked softly. "I have references," he quipped, though his voice cracked. Hermione stepped closer, bridging the final distance between them. She reached out and took his hand, intertwining their fingers. "I don't need references," she whispered. "Take me there." Draco exhaled, a sound of profound relief. He squeezed her hand, pulling her into the side-along apparition. "Hold on tight, Granger," he murmured. And as the world twisted into darkness, Hermione held on. She held on as if he was the only solid thing in the universe. The crack of apparition was a sharp, disorienting tear in the fabric of the night, followed immediately by the profound, ringing silence of a space that was entirely, hermetically sealed from the world. Hermione stumbled as her feet hit the floorboards, her center of gravity thrown off by the sudden shift from the ministry's expansive atrium to this contained, private darkness. She would have fallen had a hand not shot out to steady her. Draco caught her by the elbow, his grip firm and grounding, absorbing the shock of their landing. "Easy," he murmured, his voice sounding different here. Stripped of the ambient noise of the ball, it was deeper, rougher. "The wards are a bit heavy. They tend to knock the wind out of guests. Not that I have many." Hermione blinked, the spots of light from the camera flashes still dancing in her vision. As her eyes adjusted, the room materialized around them out of the shadows. She had expected, well, she wasn't sure. Cold marble, perhaps. Dark velvet drapes shutting out the sun. The austere, museum-like quality of Malfoy Manor. She did not expect this. They were standing in a wide, high-ceilinged drawing room in a flat that felt distinctly, surprisingly modern. One entire wall was glass, floor to ceiling, revealing a panoramic, rain-blurred view of the London skyline. Muggle London, glittering like a spilled jewelry box. The furniture was low and sleek, upholstered in charcoal wool and distressed leather. There were books everywhere, not the neatly curated, leather-bound tomes of a pure-blood library, but stacks of them, precariously balanced on side tables, piled on the floor, open and face down on the arm of a sofa. It smelled of him, cedar and parchment, but also of something else. Coffee, old wood, solitude. "Welcome to the exile," Draco said, releasing her arm and stepping back. He sounded self-conscious, a note of defensiveness creeping into his tone as he watched her survey his sanctuary. "It's not the manner. Thank Merlin." "It's beautiful," Hermione said honestly, her voice soft in the large room. She took a step forward, wincing as her heel dug into the deep pile of the rug. "You live in Muggle London?" "Kensington," he replied, turning away to walk toward a liquor cabinet that gleamed in the corner. "The neighbours don't ask questions. They just assume I'm an eccentric trust fund brat with a nocturnal lifestyle, which, I suppose, isn't entirely inaccurate." He flicked his wand at the fireplace without looking at it. A fire roared to life instantly, not green with flue powder, but a warm, crackling orange that threw long, dancing shadows across the room. The sudden light softened the sharp angles of the furniture and cast a golden glow over Draco's profile as he uncorked a bottle. "Wine?" he asked, holding up a dark bottle. "Or do you need something stronger after McLagan's ambush?" "Wine is fine," she said. She felt strange standing there in the middle of his living room, still wrapped in her midnight blue gala dress, clutching her beaded bag like a lifeline. The intimacy of the situation was hitting her in waves. They were alone, truly alone. No Kingsley, no press, no war. Just a man and a woman, and the heavy, unspoken history between them. "Sit, Granger," Draco said over his shoulder, hearing the hesitation in her silence. "You're hovering. It's making the furniture nervous." Hermione let out a breathy laugh and moved toward the sofa that faced the fire. She sat down gingerly, the cushions sinking under her weight, enveloping her. It was dangerously comfortable. Her feet were throbbing, a rhythmic pulse of pain that traveled up her calves. She longed to kick the shoes off, but some lingering reserve, some need to maintain a shred of decorum, stopped her. Draco walked over, carrying 2 glasses. He had shed the heavy ceremonial robes of the ball somewhere between the door and the cabinet, leaving him in his black trousers and the white dress shirt. He had undone the top 2 buttons, exposing the hollow of his throat, and rolled the sleeves up to his elbows. The dark mark was there, on his left forearm. He didn't hide it. He didn't flaunt it either. It was just there, a faded scar on pale skin, a fact of his existence like the color of his eyes. He handed her a glass. Their fingers brushed, a deliberate, lingering contact that sent a jolt of heat through her that had nothing to do with the fire. "To the escape," he said quietly, raising his glass. "To the escape," she echoed. They drank. The wine was exquisite, deep, complex, and tasting of blackberries and earth. It warmed her chest, chasing away the last of the ministry's chill. Draco didn't sit on the sofa with her. Instead, he chose the leather armchair adjacent to it, positioning himself at a slight angle so he could watch her, but giving her space. It was a respectful distance, but his eyes bridged the gap effortlessly. "So," he said, swirling the liquid in his glass, his gaze fixed on the fire. "Hermione Granger in my flat. If I told my 16-year-old self this, he'd probably hex me." "If I told my 16-year-old self," Hermione countered, relaxing slightly into the cushions. "She'd assume I was here to arrest you." Draco chuckled, a dry, humourless sound. A fair assumption, and one that has been true for most of the aura department for the last 3 years. He looked at her then, his expression sobering. Why did you come, really? You could have apparated home. You could have gone to Potter's. Hermione traced the rim of her glass with a finger. Why had she come? It wasn't just the wine or the banter. Because I didn't want the night to end, she admitted, the truth tumbling out before she could polish it. And because I'm tired of everyone treating me like I'm made of glass or gold. You were the only person tonight who treated me like a human being, even if you were annoying about it. Draco's lips quirked. I aim to please, or displease, as the case may be. He took a long sip of wine, his eyes never leaving her face. The intensity of his focus was unnerving, yet validating. He was seeing her, not the war hero. You look in pain, he observed suddenly. Hermione blinked, startled. What? You're flinching every time you shift your weight, he pointed out, gesturing vaguely with his glass toward her legs. And you've been curling your toes for the last 10 minutes. It's either a very obscure dark curse, or those shoes are torture devices. Hermione blushed, looking down at her heels. They were beautiful, strappy silver things that elongated her legs, but they were currently slicing into her skin with vindictive glee. It's the shoes, she confessed. Fashion requires sacrifice. Stupidity requires sacrifice, Draco corrected gently. Fashion should just require a tailor. He set his glass down on the low coffee table with a decisive click. Take them off, Granger. You're ruining my relaxing evening ambience with your projecting of physical agony. I'm not projecting. You are. It's loud. Take them off. It was a command, but wrapped in that same protective layer she had felt at the ball. Hermione hesitated, then bent down. Her fingers fumbled with the delicate silver buckles. The strap on her left foot was tight, swollen against her skin. She hissed in frustration as her nail caught on the metal. Stop, Draco said. He was moving before she realized it. He slid off the armchair and onto the rug, moving on his knees until he was in front of her. He didn't kneel in supplication. He knelt with the practical efficiency of a healer, or perhaps a servant who had forgotten his place. Draco, you don't have to. Hush, he murmured, his head bent over her foot. You're doing it wrong. You're going to tear the strap. His hands replaced hers. His fingers were cool, contrasting sharply with her overheated skin. The touch was electric. Hermione froze, her breath catching in her throat. She watched the top of his head, the platinum hair gleaming in the firelight as his deft, long fingers worked the buckle. There was something incredibly intimate about the moment. The Golden Girl sitting on a velvet sofa, and the former Death Eater kneeling at her feet, undressing her. Not for sex, but for relief. The buckle gave way. Draco slid the strap free, then gently, reverently, peeled the shoe from her foot. The relief was instantaneous and overwhelming. Hermione let out a small, involuntary moan as the pressure released. Draco froze for a second, his hands still holding her heel. He didn't look up, but she saw the muscles in his throat work as he swallowed. Better? He asked, his voice rough. Yes, she whispered. Much. He moved to the other foot. His touch was confident now. He unbuckled the second shoe and set it aside. But instead of pulling away, his hands lingered. He held her bare feet in his palms, his thumbs brushing lightly against the arch of her foot. It wasn't a massage yet, just a hold. a grounding. Hermione looked at him, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She should pull away. This was too much. This was breaking every rule of the unspoken truce. "You have cold hands," she said, her voice trembling. "And you have warm feet," he replied, finally looking up. His face was open, unguarded in a way she had never seen. The grey eyes were vast and stormy, filled with a conflict that mirrored her own. He was kneeling between her legs, his hands on her skin, and the air between them was so thick with tension it felt like ozone before a lightning strike. "Draco," she said, testing the name again. It rolled off her tongue like a secret. "I shouldn't be doing this," he said, but he didn't let go. His thumbs began to move in slow, circular motions against her insteps. "I should offer you tea. I should ask you about your work. I should keep my distance." "Why don't you?" she asked, leaning forward slightly. "Because," he whispered, his gaze dropping to her lips, "I have spent 10 years watching you from across rooms, Granger, and I am tired of the distance." The confession hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Hermione felt the walls of her own defenses crumbling. The logic, the history, the reasons why they shouldn't. They all dissolved under the pressure of his hands and the honesty in his eyes. "I'm not going to run, Draco," she said softly. He searched her face, looking for a lie, for a trap. Finding none, he let out a shuddering breath. He shifted his grip, his fingers gliding up to her ankles, his touch firming. "Good," he murmured, "because I don't think I could let you go if you tried." He stood up then, the movement sudden and fluid, breaking the trance, but not the connection. He didn't retreat. He simply moved to the sofa, sitting down next to her. Close, so close their thighs brushed against the velvet. He picked up his wineglass again, but his hand was shaking slightly. "Tell me about the book," he said, his voice striving for normalcy, but vibrating with the undercurrent of what had just happened. "The one you were reading, the romance novel." Hermione stared at him, bewildered by the whiplash. "What?" "Distract me, Granger," he said, staring into the fire, his jaw clenched. "Tell me about the happy ending, because if we sit here in silence for one more minute, I am going to do something extremely reckless." Hermione looked at his profile, the tension in his neck, the white-knuckle grip on the glass. She realized then that he was holding back for her. He was terrified of frightening her, of moving too fast, of ruining this fragile thing they were building. A wave of tenderness washed over her. She reached out and took the glass from his hand, setting it on the table beside hers. Then she took his hand in hers, interlacing their fingers. "It's about a duke," she began, her voice steady and warm. "Who thinks he's too broken to be loved?" Draco turned his head slowly, his eyes locking onto hers. He squeezed her hand, a grip that was desperate and anchoring. "Go on," he whispered. "And the woman," Hermione continued, leaning her head back against the cushion, turning to face him, "who proves him wrong." The fire crackled, casting long shadows that danced across the walls, knitting them together in the darkness. The storm outside lashed against the glass, but inside, in the quiet exile of Draco Malfoy's flat, the world was beginning to change. The fire in the grate had settled into a steady, glowing slumber, casting a warm, flickering light that painted the room in shades of amber and deep shadow. Outside, the rain lashed against the panoramic window, a rhythmic drumming that emphasized the stillness inside. Hermione was mid-sentence, her hands animating the air as she described the climax of the novel. And so, naturally, she assumes he's left for the continent because he doesn't love her, when in reality, he's just gone to buy her a pony. Draco, sprawled with deceptive laziness in the armchair, snorted into his wineglass. The sound was unrefined, startlingly genuine. "A pony?" he repeated, arching a pale eyebrow. "That is the grand romantic gesture? Equine bribery?" "It was a very specific pony," Hermione defended, though a smile tugged at her lips. She was curled into the corner of the sofa now, her legs tucked beneath her, the midnight blue silk of her dress pooling like water around her. The tension that had held her spine rigid all night had dissolved, replaced by a languid, heavy comfort. It symbolized her freedom. It's metaphorical, Malfoy. "It's ridiculous, Granger," he countered, though his eyes were crinkled at the corners. "If I were trying to woo a witch who thought I was a brooding, emotionally stunted aristocrat, I certainly wouldn't buy her livestock. I'd buy her a library, or perhaps a silence charm for her enemies." Hermione laughed, the sound bubbling up from her chest, bright and uninhibited. It felt strange to laugh like this, freely, without looking over her shoulder, in the presence of Draco Malfoy. It felt like a betrayal of the past, and yet it felt like the most honest thing she had done in years. "You're pragmatic to a fault," she teased, tilting her head. The movement caused a loose curl to fall into her eyes. Draco watched the lock of hair, his fingers twitching against the stem of his glass, as if he wanted to reach out and tuck it back. He didn't. Instead, he took a sip of wine, his gaze darkening slightly. "Pragmatism is a survival skill," he murmured. "Romanticism gets you killed, or worse, it gets you heartbroken." The playful atmosphere shifted, the air growing heavier. The seesaw tipped. Hermione felt the sudden withdrawal in him. Not physical, he hadn't moved an inch, but emotional. The shutters were coming down. She set her glass on the low table, the sharp click echoing in the quiet room. "Is that what you think this is?" she asked softly. "A survival skill? Us sitting here?" Draco looked away, staring into the dying embers of the fire. The playful smirk was gone, replaced by a look of profound weariness. "I don't know what this is, Granger. I suspect it's a hallucination brought on by cheap ministry champagne and sleep deprivation." He stood up suddenly, the movement restless and jagged. He walked to the window, turning his back to her. His silhouette was stark against the backdrop of the rain-streaked glass and the blurred lights of London. "You should go," he said, his voice flat. "The sun will be up in a few hours. The magic of the ball wears off at dawn, doesn't it? That's how the fairy tale goes. Then the coach turns back into a pumpkin, and I turn back into, well, me." Hermione watched him, her heart aching for the boy who had been raised to be a prince and had grown up to be a pariah. She saw the stiffness in his shoulders, the defensive line of his back. He was waiting for her to agree. He was waiting for her to realize her mistake and leave. It would be so easy to go, to pick up her shoes, apparate to her silent flat, and wake up tomorrow pretending this was just a strange, feverish dream. But Hermione Granger had never chosen the easy path. She stood up. Her feet, still bare, sank into the plush rug as she walked toward him. She moved quietly, but he tensed as she approached, sensing her presence. She stopped a few feet behind him, close enough to smell the cedar and rain that clung to him, but far enough to give him space to breathe. "You're wrong," she said, her voice clear and steady. Draco didn't turn. "Am I? You think the Daily Prophet will write kind things about this? War heroine consorts with ex-Death Eater? They'll tear you apart, Hermione, and I won't be able to stop them." "I don't care about the Prophet," she said, stepping closer. "And I'm not talking about the press. I'm talking about you." She reached out, her hand hovering for a second before settling lightly on his shoulder. The muscle beneath his shirt was rock hard, coiled tight with tension. He flinched, a microscopic tremor, but he didn't pull away. "You think you're a monster," she whispered. "You think you're poison. But monsters don't shield people from unwanted dances. Poison doesn't listen to stories about romance novels at 3 a.m. Draco turned then, spinning around so quickly that her hand fell from his shoulder. His face was twisted with a sudden, sharp anger, his grey eyes blazing. "Don't romanticize me," he snapped, the words biting. "I am not one of your projects, Granger. I am not a house elf to be liberated or a law to be rewritten. I am the man who watched you scream on his drawing room floor and did nothing." The words hung in the air, brutal and ugly. It was the elephant in the room, the rot at the center of the foundation. He had thrown it at her like a weapon, expecting it to cut, expecting it to drive her away. Hermione didn't flinch. She felt the old phantom pain, the echo of the knife. But she also felt the overwhelming, crushing guilt radiating from him. It wasn't malice. It was self-hatred. "I know," she said, her voice dropping to a hush. "I was there, remember?" "Then why?" he demanded, his voice cracking. "Why are you here? Why are you drinking my wine and laughing at my jokes? You should hate me. You have every right to curse me, to spit on me." "Why aren't you?" "Because I'm tired of hating Draco," she said, stepping into his space, forcing him to look at her. "And because I saw you. I saw you lower your wand on the astronomy tower. I saw you lie to Bellatrix to save Harry. I saw you tonight." She reached up, her fingers brushing the lapel of his shirt. It was a bold, terrifying move. "We're all broken, Draco. Some of us just hide it better than others. You're not the only one with ghosts." Draco stared at her, his chest heaving as if he had just run a marathon. The anger drained out of him as quickly as it had come, leaving him hollow and exposed. He looked at her hand on his chest, then up to her eyes, his expression crumbling into something raw and desperate. "I don't deserve this," he whispered, the words barely audible. "I don't deserve you." "That's not for you to decide," she countered softly. For a long moment there was only the sound of the rain and their breathing. The tension shifted again, from conflict to something magnetic. The repulsion had failed. The approach had won. Draco raised his hand slowly, as if moving through water. His fingers trembled as they grazed her jawline, his thumb resting near the corner of her mouth. His touch was reverent, terrified, as if he expected her to shatter. "You are infuriating," he murmured, but there was no heat in it, only wonder. Hermione leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut. "I've been told." His thumb traced her lower lip, a feather-light caress that sent a jolt of electricity straight to her toes. The air between them crackled, thick with unsaid words and suppressed desires. He was going to kiss her. She knew it. She wanted it. But then, a loud, growling rumble broke the silence. Draco froze. Hermione's eyes snapped open. The sound came again, a distinct, demanding growl from the vicinity of her stomach. Hermione turned a brilliant shade of crimson, stepping back and covering her midsection with her hands. The spell was broken, shattered by the mundane reality of biology. Draco stared at her for a second, stunned. Then a corner of his mouth twitched, then the other, and then he was laughing. Not the polite chuckle from before, but a real open laugh that transformed his face, erasing the shadows and the years. "The Golden Girl," he gasped, shaking his head. "Defeater of Dark Lords, brightest witch of her age, defeated by Amidst dinner." "It's not funny," Hermione protested, though she was smiling too, mortified but relieved. The intensity of the moment had been too much, too fast. This grounded humor was safer. "I didn't eat anything at the ball. I was too busy dodging the French delegation." "And I was too busy dodging you," Draco admitted, wiping a tear of mirth from his eye. "Merlin, I'm starving too. I think the last thing I ate was a grape at noon." He ran a hand through his hair, messing it up further, looking suddenly boyish and approachable. "Right. Food. I can't have you fainting in my flat. It would look terrible on the autopsy report." "Do you have anything?" Hermione asked hopefully. "I have a house elf who insists on stocking my pantry as if I'm feeding a regiment," Draco said, moving toward the small kitchen area that was separated from the living room by a marble island. "Let's see. We have truffle cheese, some sort of cured ham that costs more than my broomstick, and, crackers." "A feast," Hermione declared, following him. She hopped up onto one of the high stools at the island, watching him move around the kitchen. There was a domesticity to it that made her heart ache in a good way. Draco Malfoy, plating cheese and crackers at 4 a.m, his sleeves rolled up, looking for a knife. It was surreal. It was perfect. He set a wooden board between them, laden with the scavenged food. He poured them both more wine, just a splash this time. "To survival," he said, raising his glass again, echoing their toast from the ball. But the meaning had changed. It wasn't about surviving the ministry anymore. It was about surviving each other. "To snacks," Hermione corrected, grabbing a cracker. They ate in a comfortable silence for a while. The earlier heaviness dissipated, but not forgotten. It lingered in the corners of the room, a ghost waiting to return. But for now, they held it at bay with cheese and wine. "So," Draco said, tearing a piece of ham, "if you weren't an aura, or a lawyer, or whatever it is you're doing to save the world this week, what would you be?" Hermione chewed thoughtfully. "A healer, maybe, or an unspeakable. I like secrets." "You?" Draco snorted. "You can't keep a secret to save your life. You have a very loud face, Granger." "I do not." "You do. When you're annoyed, your left nostril flares. When you're lying, you touch your neck. And when you're happy." He trailed off, his eyes catching hers. "What?" she whispered. "What do I do when I'm happy?" Draco looked at her, his gaze dropping to her mouth. "You glow," he said softly. "It's annoying. It makes it very hard to ignore you." Hermione felt the flush return to her cheeks. She looked down at her hands, tracing the grain of the wood on the counter. "I thought you liked ignoring me." "I did," he admitted. "It was safer, but I'm finding that I don't want to anymore." He reached across the island, his hand covering hers. This time there was no hesitation. His skin was warm, his grip firm. "Hermione," he said, and the use of her name sent a shiver down her spine. "I'm glad you're here, even if it is a disaster waiting to happen." "It's not a disaster," she said, looking up at him. "It's just complicated." "Complicated," he agreed. "I can do complicated." He squeezed her hand, then released it, standing up. The mood shifted again, slowing down, deepening. The adrenaline of the argument and the laughter was fading, replaced by a heavy, languid exhaustion. "Come," he said, gesturing back to the living room. "The fire is dying, and you still look like you're in pain." Hermione slid off the stool, her feet protesting as they hit the floor. She winced, unable to hide it this time. Draco noticed. His eyes narrowed on her bare feet. "Still hurting?" he asked gently. "A bit," she admitted. "Dancing in 4-inch heels for 3 hours wasn't my brightest idea." "Vanity, Granger," he tisked, but he was walking toward the sofa, beckoning her to follow. "Come here. Sit." He sat down on the edge of the sofa, patting the cushion next to him. But then he shifted, sliding down to the floor again, resting his back against the armchair. He patted the space on the rug in front of him, between his spread legs. "Sit," he repeated. "Let me help." It was an invitation that blurred the lines completely. To sit there, with him, in the space between his legs. It was intimate. It was trusting. Hermione hesitated only for a heartbeat. Then she walked over and sat down on the rug, her back to him, pulling her knees up. She felt him shift behind her. He reached for a cushion from the sofa and placed it behind her back, creating a soft barrier between them, but his legs still bracketed hers. "Relax," he murmured near her ear. Then his hands reached down and took her left foot. Hermione let out a long, shaky breath as his fingers closed around her ankle. The warmth of his hands was seeping into her skin, melting the ice that had formed around her heart. "You don't have to do this," she whispered, one last weak protest. "I know," Draco said, his thumb pressing into the arch of her foot, drawing a gasp from her lips. "I want to." The storm outside raged on, but inside, the quiet circle of the firelight, the world had narrowed down to the touch of his hands and the beat of her heart. The seesaw had stopped moving. It had settled, finally, on something that felt dangerously, wonderfully like hope. The first touch was tentative, a question asked in the language of skin against skin. Draco's thumbs pressed into the sole of her left foot, just below the ball, and Hermione let out a sound that was half sigh, half whimper. It was a traitorous sound, one that belonged in a bedroom, not a living room, but the relief was so sharp it bypassed her filter entirely. "Relax, Granger," Draco murmured, his voice dropping an octave, vibrating against her back, where she leaned against the cushion he had placed between them. "You're holding tension in places I didn't know existed. Do you clench your toes when you read?" I don't know," she stammered, her eyes fluttering shut. The sensation was overwhelming. His hands were large, encompassing her entire foot, his fingers long and surprisingly strong. There was a roughness to his palms, calluses from years of gripping a broomstick or a wand, that provided a delicious friction against her silk-soft skin. "You do," he decided, his thumbs beginning a slow, deliberate circle outward toward the edges of her foot. "You're a menace to your own skeletal structure." Hermione couldn't retort. The connection between her brain and her mouth had been severed. replaced by a direct line from his hands to her nervous system. He worked with a rhythm that felt practiced, intuitive. He wasn't just rubbing, he was mapping the pain and systematically dismantling it. He found a knot of tension in her arch and pressed firmly, holding the pressure until she exhaled a long, shuddering breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Breathe," he instructed softly. "Let it go." It was an impossible command. To let go meant to surrender, and surrendering to Draco Malfoy was a concept her mind still struggled to process, even as her body melted into the rug. But the firelight was warm. The rain against the glass created a cocoon of white noise, and the scent of him, cedar, parchment, and the faint metallic tang of the storm, was filling her senses, drugging her into compliance. She let her head fall back, resting it against the sofa cushion, her neck exposed. Where did you learn to do this?" she whispered, her voice thick with drowsiness. Draco's hands didn't stop, but the rhythm slowed slightly. "Narcissa," he said, the name spoken with a quiet reverence. After the war, she had tremors, nerve damage from the stress, or perhaps from the curse Bellatrix used on her when she lied. He paused, his thumb tracing the delicate line of Hermione's ankle bone. She couldn't sleep. Her hands and feet would cramp. I used to sit with her for hours, just doing this, helping the blood flow, reminding her that she was still there. The confession hung in the air, fragile as spun sugar. Hermione felt a pang of sorrow so acute it pierced through the haze of pleasure. She saw the image clearly, a younger, broken Draco, stripped of his pride, kneeling before his shattered mother in the silent, empty halls of the manor, offering the only comfort he had left, his hands. "I'm sorry," she murmured. "Don't be," he said, his voice tightening slightly. "It taught me patience, something I was sorely lacking." He shifted his attention to her right foot. The loss of contact on the left was a cold shock, but the warmth of his hands returning to the right sent a fresh wave of relief washing over her. He worked the heel, his fingers digging in with precise, agonizingly good pressure. Hermione shifted, her hips turning slightly on the rug, seeking a more comfortable position. The movement brought her shoulder into contact with his chest, where he sat behind her. He stiffened for a second, then relaxed, allowing her weight to settle against him. The cushion was still there, but it felt thinner now, less of a barrier and more of a formality. "You're good at it," she admitted, the words slurring slightly. "Too good. I might fall asleep. If you drool on my rug, I'll deduct points from Gryffindor," he teased, but the bite was gone. His tone was low, intimate, a rumble that she felt in her spine. "You can't," she mumbled, a smile touching her lips. "I'm head of the department. I make the rules." "Tyrant," he whispered. He moved his hands up, his fingers gliding over her ankles to the curve of her calves. The muscles there were tight as bowstrings from hours of balancing in heels. Draco groaned, a sound of sympathetic frustration, and began to knead the muscle. "Merlin, Hermione," he said, the use of her first name slipping out again, effortless this time. "You walk like you're carrying the weight of the world. You need to stop." "I can't," she said, the playful mood darkening. "There's always more laws to fix, more people to save. If you stop, what?" he prompted, his hands slowing, his thumbs pressing deep into the muscle of her calf. "If I stop, I might realize how tired I am, she confessed, the truth stripping her bare. And I might not be able to start again. Draco's hands stilled. For a moment, there was only the sound of the rain and the crackle of the fire. Then he resumed the massage, but the touch was different now. Gentler, less clinical. It was a caress. Then don't start again, he said fiercely, his voice close to her ear. Not tonight. Tonight, you just stop. You exist. That is enough. Hermione felt tears prick at her eyes. It was the permission she hadn't known she needed. To just be. Not the golden girl, not the savior, not the bureaucrat. Just a woman, sitting on a rug in the middle of the night, being cared for by a man who understood the weight of ghosts. She turned her head, looking over her shoulder. Draco was watching her, his face illuminated by the dying fire. His expression was unguarded, his grey eyes dark and swimming with an emotion she couldn't name, something between hunger and worship. Draco, she whispered. He looked at her, his hands still resting on her calves, grounding her. What? Why are you doing this? She asked again, needing to hear it. Really? He looked down at his hands on her skin, then back up to her eyes. The mask was gone completely now. He looked young and scared and beautifully human. Because, he said, his voice rough, because for 10 years I have watched you save everyone else, and I wondered, who saves you? The question hit her like a physical blow. It disarmed her completely. She turned fully, shifting her legs so she could face him, pulling them away from his grasp, but staying within the circle of his presence. She sat cross-legged, facing him, their knees brushing. No one, she admitted, her voice trembling. No one ever asks. I'm asking, he said. He reached out, not for her feet this time, but for her hand. He took it, turning it over in his palm, tracing the lines with his thumb. He looked at the scar on her arm, the one Bellatrix had carved. It was hidden beneath her glamour, invisible to the eye, but he knew it was there. His thumb brushed the air above it, not touching, but acknowledging. I can't fix the past, Hermione, he said, his voice thick with guilt. I can't erase what happened in that room. I can't give you back the years you spent fighting. I know, she whispered. But, he continued, looking up at her, his eyes burning with intensity. I can give you this, tonight. Silence, safety, a place where you don't have to be strong. Hermione looked at him, really looked at him. She saw the lines of strain around his mouth, the shadows under his eyes. He was offering her sanctuary, but he was starving for it himself. He was a man who had been defined by his worst mistakes, desperately trying to find a way to be good. You're not just giving it to me, are you? She asked softly. You need it too. Draco flinched, as if she had touched a raw nerve. He looked away toward the window. I told you, I'm selfish. No, she said, reaching out to cup his cheek, turning his face back to hers. His skin was cool, rough with stubble. You're lonely. He leaned into her hand, his eyes closing for a brief second. It was a gesture of such profound surrender that Hermione's heart clenched. Gods, Hermione, he breathed. You have no idea. The tension in the room shifted again, thickening, coiling around them. It wasn't the jagged tension of an argument, or the playful tension of banter. It was the heavy gravitational pull of two celestial bodies finally colliding. Draco opened his eyes. They were wide, dilated, fixed on her mouth. If I kiss you, he whispered, the words tumbling out as if he couldn't stop them. I am going to ruin everything. The truce, the peace, your reputation. I don't care about my reputation, she said, her thumb stroking his cheekbone. I do, he argued weakly. You're Hermione Granger, and I'm the mistake you're not supposed to make. You're not a mistake, Draco, she said firmly. You're the only person who has made me feel real in a very long time. She leaned in, closing the distance between them by inches. She could feel his breath on her lips, warm, smelling of wine and mint. She could feel the heat radiating from him, a furnace beneath the cool exterior. Tell me to stop, he pleaded, his hand coming up to grip her wrist, holding her hand against his face. Tell me to stop, and I will. I swear it. Don't you dare stop, she whispered. Draco let out a sound, a broken, desperate noise, and shifted. He moved from his seated position, leaning forward, invading her space completely. But instead of kissing her lips, he lowered his head. He pressed his forehead against hers, closing his eyes. They stayed there for a long moment, breathing the same air, their hearts beating a frantic, synchronized rhythm in the silence. It was an intimacy far more terrifying than a kiss. It was an admission of need. I tried to hate you, he murmured against her skin. It was so much easier when I hated you. I know, she replied, her hands moving to tangle in the soft hair at the nape of his neck. I tried too. We failed miserably, he noted dryly. Catastrophically, she agreed. He pulled back slightly, just enough to look her in the eyes. The grey was swirling with silver, alive with emotion. He looked down at her feet, still bare on the rug, then back up at her face. Your feet are cold again, he noted, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. Then warm them, she challenged softly. Draco's gaze darkened. He shifted back, settling against the armchair, and pulled her legs back into his lap. The movement was possessive, definitive. He wasn't just offering a service anymore. He was claiming his place. He took her right foot in his hands again, but this time the touch wasn't clinical. It was slower. He ran his palms up her arch, his fingers trailing over her skin with a feather-light touch that sent shivers racing up her legs. You have beautiful feet, he murmured, almost to himself. Small, strong, like the rest of you. Hermione blushed, the heat spreading from her chest to her hairline. They're just feet, Draco. Nothing about you is just anything, he corrected. He lifted her foot slightly. Hermione held her breath. He lowered his head, and for a second she thought he was examining a bruise. Then she felt it, the warmth of his breath against her skin, and then the soft, shocking press of his lips against her instep. It wasn't a sexual kiss. It was something far more dangerous. It was a kiss of fealty, a kiss of adoration. It was the kind of gesture a knight offered a queen, or a sinner offered a saint. Hermione gasped, her hands gripping the cushion of the sofa. The sensation was electric, grounding and soaring all at once. He lingered there, his lips pressed to the delicate skin where her pulse beat, his eyes closed. He stayed there for a heartbeat, 2, 3. Then he pulled back, looking up at her through his lashes. Better? He asked, his voice a low growl. Hermione couldn't speak. She could only nod. The walls were gone. The war was over. And in the quiet of his flat, with the rain washing the world clean outside, Hermione Granger realized she was in terrible, wonderful trouble. She was falling in love with Draco Malfoy. and judging by the look in his eyes, terrified, hopeful, and utterly wrecked, he had already fallen. "One more," he whispered, reaching for her other foot. "Draco," she breathed, finding her voice. "Hush," he said. "Let me take care of you." And she did. She let him. She watched him, this boy she had fought, this man she was learning to know, as he treated her battered, tired feet like they were the most precious things in the world. And with every touch, every brush of his thumb, every stolen glance, the last of her doubts dissolved into the firelight. The night was ending, but something else, something brighter, warmer, and infinitely more terrifying, was just beginning. The silence that followed the brush of his lips against her skin was absolute. It was not the empty silence of a room where conversation had died, but the heavy, vibrating silence of a universe holding its breath. The rain outside seemed to retreat, the drumming against the glass fading into a distant hush, leaving only the sound of the fire popping in the grate and the ragged rhythm of their own breathing. Hermione sat frozen, her heart hammering a frantic tattoo against her ribs. Her foot, still cradled in Draco's hands, felt branded. The spot where his mouth had lingered burned with a phantom warmth, a sensation that travelled up her leg and settled deep in her chest, unspooling the tight knot of anxiety she had carried for years. Draco didn't look up immediately. He kept his head bowed, his thumbs resting idly on her ankle, his posture radiating a terrifying stillness. He looked like a man awaiting a verdict, bracing himself for the hex, the shout, the inevitable rejection. He had crossed a line. They both knew it. He had taken the truce, fragile as spun sugar, and shattered it with a gesture of worship that belonged nowhere near a pretend friendship. "Draco," Hermione whispered. Her voice was unrecognizable, husky, trembling. He flinched. Slowly, agonizingly, he lifted his head. His face was pale, the firelight casting deep shadows under his eyes, making the grey irises look almost black. There was no sneer, no mask, no aristocratic boredom. There was only naked fear and a desperate, aching hunger. "I apologize," he said, his voice rough, scraping against the silence. He started to pull his hands away, his fingers uncurling from her skin. That was presumptuous. The wine, the exhaustion. I didn't mean to. "Don't," Hermione interrupted, the word sharp. She didn't pull her leg back. Instead, she leaned forward, reaching out to catch his wrist before he could retreat entirely. Her fingers wrapped around the cool bone, feeling the frantic pulse beating beneath the skin. "Don't you dare apologize for that." Draco froze, staring at her hand on his wrist, then up at her face. "Hermione, You didn't mean it?" she challenged softly, searching his eyes. "Is that what you were going to say? That you didn't mean to touch me? That you didn't mean to look at me like that?" "I meant it," he breathed, the confession torn from him. "I meant every second of it. That's the problem." He let out a harsh, self-deprecating laugh and looked away toward the dark window. "I'm a Malfoy, Hermione. I'm the wreckage of a war you won. You're the sun, and I'm just the idiot standing in the shadows, hoping not to get burned." "Stop it," she said firmly, tightening her grip on his wrist. "Stop telling me who we're supposed to be. I'm not a statue in the Ministry, Draco. I'm a woman who is currently sitting on your rug, drinking your wine, and not wanting to be anywhere else." She tugged on his arm, a silent command. Come here." Draco hesitated. He looked at the distance between them, mere inches physically, but miles historically. He looked at the couch where she sat, elevated slightly above him, and the floor where he knelt. It was a tableau of their lives, her on the pedestal, him in the dirt. "Come here," she whispered again, softer this time. Slowly, Draco shifted. He released her foot, placing it gently on the rug, and rose from his knees. He didn't sit in the armchair. He sat next to her on the sofa, sinking into the plush velvet. He was close enough now that she could feel the heat radiating from his side, close enough to see the individual lashes framing his eyes, the faint silver scar on his chin. He didn't touch her. He sat with his hands clasped tightly between his knees, staring at them as if they were foreign objects. "So," he said, his voice low, "what happens now? The sun comes up in 3 hours. The pumpkin returns. Reality crashes back in." "It doesn't have to," Hermione said. She turned her body toward him, tucking her legs beneath her. "We can just stay. Here. In my flat?" Draco looked at her, incredulous. "Hiding from the world?" "Why not?" She shrugged, a small smile playing on her lips. "I have plenty of vacation days saved up. Shacklebolt owes me a favor, and you have an excellent wine cellar." "And after the wine runs out?" Draco asked, his gaze piercing. "When you have to go back to being the golden girl, and I go back to being the pariah? What then, Granger? Do we pretend this—" He gestured vaguely between them. "Never happened? Do we go back to polite nods in the lift?" "I don't think I can go back to that," Hermione admitted, her voice quiet. "Not after tonight." "Neither can I," Draco confessed. The admission seemed to drain the last of his resistance. He turned fully toward her, his body mirroring hers. "Which leaves us in a precarious position. Because if I kiss you, Hermione, really kiss you, not just your foot, I am not going to let you go. I am possessive. I am damaged. And I am entirely too selfish to let you walk away once I have you." Hermione's breath hitched. The warning was there, clear and sharp, but it didn't sound like a threat. It sounded like a promise. "Then don't let me go," she whispered. The air in the room seemed to snap. The last barrier dissolved. Draco moved. It wasn't a rush, it was a gravitation. He reached out, his hand cupping her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a reverence that made her tremble. His skin was cool, but his eyes were burning. "You have no idea," he murmured, his gaze dropping to her lips, "how long I have wanted to do this." He leaned in. Hermione closed her eyes, tilting her head back, meeting him halfway. The kiss, when it came, was soft. It wasn't the crashing of waves or the explosion of stars. It was the slide of a key into a lock. It was a sigh of relief. His lips were warm, firm, and incredibly gentle. He tasted of the dark wine and the peppermint of the crackers, of something uniquely Draco. Hermione let out a small sound in her throat, her hands coming up to clutch the lapels of his shirt, pulling him closer. At her touch, Draco groaned, a low rumble in his chest, and the kiss deepened. The gentleness gave way to a desperate, starving intensity. His other hand slid into her hair, tangling in the curls, tilting her head to deepen the angle. He kissed her like a man drowning, drinking her in, trying to memorize the taste of her, the feel of her, the reality of her. It was chaotic and messy and perfect. It was 10 years of anger, 5 years of silence, and 1 night of unexpected grace, all poured into a single embrace. Hermione felt herself melting, her boundaries dissolving. She wasn't the war hero here. She wasn't the smartest witch of her age. She was just Hermione, and he was just Draco, and somehow, against all odds, they fit. He pulled back slightly, just an inch, his forehead resting against hers. His breathing was ragged, his chest heaving against hers. "Real," he whispered, the word a shudder against her lips. "You're real." "I am," she replied, her fingers stroking the back of his neck, playing with the short hairs there. "And so are you." Draco let out a shaky laugh. He opened his eyes, the grey now blown wide, pupils dilated, filled with a wonder that broke her heart and put it back together again. "I think," he said unsteadily, "that I might be in trouble." "Terrible trouble," Hermione agreed, a smile blooming on her swollen lips. "But I'm afraid you're stuck with me now. You did promise a foot massage, and I have the other foot waiting." Draco chuckled, the sound rich and genuine. He kissed her nose, then her forehead, then her lips one more time. A quick, hard press that sealed the deal. "The foot massage can wait," he murmured, shifting so that he could pull her properly into his arms. He leaned back against the corner of the sofa, dragging her with him until she was resting against his chest, her head tucked under his chin. "Right now, I just want to hold you, before the sun comes up." Hermione settled against him, her body moulding to his as if they had been made for this. The heavy wool of his shirt was scratchy against her cheek, but his arm around her was solid and warm, an anchor in the storm. She could hear his heart beating beneath her ear, a steady, strong rhythm that lulled her. "Draco?" she asked softly, watching the dying embers of the fire. His hand was rubbing slow, soothing circles on her arm. "What if the papers do find out?" He paused for a moment. Then he pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "Then let them," he said. And for the first time his voice held no fear, only a quiet, steely resolve. "Let them write whatever they want. I have the only thing that matters right here." Hermione smiled, closing her eyes. The anxiety that had plagued her all night, the fear of the ball, the fear of loneliness, the fear of the future, was gone. In its place was a profound, quiet peace. Outside, the rain had stopped. The first grey light of dawn was beginning to bleed into the sky over London, turning the black glass to charcoal. The magic of the night was fading, but the magic in the room, the tentative, terrifying, wonderful magic of a new beginning, was just starting to take root. "Sleep, Granger," Draco whispered, his voice heavy with sleep himself. "I'll be here when you wake up. Promise?" "Promise. Unbreakable vow if necessary." "That won't be necessary," she murmured, drifting off. "I trust you." The words hung in the air, more powerful than any spell. Hermione felt Draco's arm tighten around her, a silent acknowledgement of the gift she had just given him. They fell asleep like that, tangled together on the sofa in Kensington, the Golden Girl and the former Death Eater, while the sun rose over a world that would never quite be the same again. And for the first time in a long time, neither of them was alone.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for listening to this story. Writing about Draco and Hermione is always special for me. Usually we see them as enemies. We know they fight, but in this story I wanted to show something different. I wanted to show them as the real people who are just tired. The Ministry Ball is full of magic and bright lights, but inside Draco and Hermione feels very lonely. They wear a mask for the world, but when they are finally alone, the mask falls off. My favorite part is the ending. It is a very simple scene when Draco helps Hermione with her shoes. He gives her a message. It is small, but it means a lot. It shows real trust. It shows that even a strong hero needs to rest. And it shows that even a former enemy can be gentle. I hope you felt the warmth in this story. I hope it made you simple. I suggest we don't say goodbye just yet, but listen to one more story in my channel.